The Supreme Court upholds the domestic violence restraining order gun ban, and President Biden bets big on gun control in the 2024 election. That and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome everybody to another installment of our news update. This week, Jake is out on vacation, so it's just going to be me and you guys here. I'm, of course, the founder of The Reload, Stephen Gutowski, CNN contributor, host of the weekly Reload podcast, which we have a very special edition of this week because it's going to deal directly with the first story that I'm going to get into here for you. And that one, of course, is the Supreme Court's major decision in the Second Amendment case, United States v. Rahimi. The court ruled 8-1 that the underlying law that Mr. Rahimi was disarmed by because he had a domestic violence restraining order was in fact constitutional on its face. Rahimi had challenged this law in its totality, so to speak. It was a facial challenge, and that meant that he had to show every possible enforcement of the law would be unconstitutional, and the court disagreed that that was the case. And not only that the law was facially constitutional, but they found that as applied to Rahimi himself, it would be constitutional. That's another type of challenge that's much less difficult to accomplish in the federal courts. But even still, and you know, it takes into account the facts of the case to the individual defendant. So as applied to Rahimi, he might have had a lower bar to meet to have the law thrown out, except for the fact that he's probably one of the worst Second Amendment defendants that you could imagine. Rahimi was issued a domestic violence restraining order after a court hearing that he had the opportunity to voice his defense at, but chose not to, and in which a judge found that he was a specific danger to the mother of his child based on a incident where he had shot a gun in her direction and assaulted her. So, and then of course he had a myriad of other charges against him related to violent crimes, including drug-related shootings and even a shooting where he shot into the air at a Whataburger because his friend's credit card had been declined. So not your ideal test case, so to speak. But regardless, the court found that the underlying law, the prohibition on gun possession by somebody subject to a domestic violence restraining order, did fit with the history and tradition of gun regulation in the United States dating back to the founding period, which is what's required, of course, under the Bruin test that was established in 2022's New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. It was a sort of landmark case that struck down New York's concealed carry law, the restrictive concealed carry law that they had at the time, and it set this history and tradition standard for all Second Amendment cases moving forward. Rahimi happens to be the first one that the court has decided. We've talked, of course, on previous episodes about other gun-related cases the court has decided, the bump stock ban, which it tossed, the First Amendment case brought by the National Rifle Association, where it sided with the National Rifle Association. But this is the only one this term that actually dealt with the Second Amendment in its claims. So it is the first one in 2 years that the court has done under this new framework they handed down in Bruin. And they concluded that it is, in fact, constitutional to disarm somebody like Rahimi. In fact, I'll give you a quick quote here from Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the opinion for 8 members of the court. You had one dissension from, actually, interestingly enough, from the author of the Bruin ruling, Justice Thomas. And we'll get, very briefly, we'll touch on what he was upset about and why he dissented in this case. And of course, we'll save more analysis of this for our interview podcast this week, which is going to feature, by the way, preeminent Second Amendment scholar David Kopel. He's works for the Independence Institute. He also filed a brief in this case, which the court has actually seemed to take into consideration in this ruling. It does allude to some of the things that he and his colleagues were arguing in that brief. So we will have him on the interview podcast that you guys will get access to if you're a Reload member, on Sunday. Everyone else, of course, will be able to listen on Monday when it goes public. But for now, I'll give you a quote from Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority in U.S. v. Rahimi. He said, quote, "When a restraining order contains a finding that an individual poses a credible threat to the physical safety of an immediate partner, that individual may, consistent with the Second Amendment, be banned from possessing firearms while the order is in effect. Since the founding, our nation's firearm laws have included provisions preventing individuals who threaten physical harm to others from misusing firearms. As applied to the facts of this case, Section 922G8, that's the federal law, right, fits comfortably within this tradition." So that's the basic holding. You'll notice that it's fairly narrow. They say that when somebody has been found by a court to be a danger to somebody else, a threat to somebody else, they can be disarmed temporarily during the length of the restraining order in this case, which the court alluded to being somewhere between 1 and 2 years. Then they can be disarmed. And the main historical analogs that they used to justify this were laws called the sureties, and also laws against riding armed to the terror of the people. So the court, and again, we go into much more specific detail on this in our interview podcast this week, so I'm not going to bog us down too much with these details, but essentially sureties were sort of like bonds that you would have to pay if somebody accused you of being a threat or threatening them or committing violence against them. You'd have to put up a bond to ensure that you wouldn't do this, that you wouldn't cause harm in the future. And then if you did, you'd lose the money from that bond. And then, of course, there were laws against riding armed to the terror of the people, and that similarly was involved someone being found to be a threat to others, and they'd be barred from carrying guns in an offensive manner. And the punishment for violating that order could be prison, which the court said is actually a more severe punishment than having your guns confiscated temporarily. So they found that those two types of laws from the founding era, which these laws existed either before the ratification of the Second Amendment or relatively shortly afterwards. So they found those they were in the proper time period, and that they were close enough to justify being a historical analog that establishes a tradition of gun restrictions that the domestic violence restraining order we have today falls into. That was their ultimate conclusion. And again, you had 8 justices in the majority, and then Justice Thomas in his dissent basically questioned exactly that, this determination that the surety laws and the riding armed to the terror of the people laws, that these were appropriate historical analogs for the domestic violence restraining order. He had several issues with them, mainly that the court had sort of cobbled them together, that neither one of them on their own was similar enough to the how and why the domestic violence restraining order gun prohibition worked. For instance, they're not the surety laws didn't necessarily disarm anyone, and the riding armed to the terror of the people was about taking a gun outside of the home, which the restraining order goes further than that and bars people from possessing guns at all. There were a number of ways that he thought these historical analogs didn't really fit the modern prohibition. And so that's why he dissented. He gave some pretty stark warnings that this broad of a reading of historical analogs could lead to severe restriction in Second Amendment rights, but of course, the other conservative justices didn't feel that way, and you had a number of them wrote their own concurrences, including Gorsuch, who spoke to Thomas's concerns, and he said that effectively they just had a disagreement over how broad you could go in terms of your point of view on what constitutes a historical analog. So Rahimi, very long ruling too. I mean, the ruling of the majority opinion, not super long, but there were a lot of concurrences, and several of them were extremely long. And then, of course, Thomas's dissent was also fairly lengthy. So, there's a lot in there. It's a lot to go through, and that's why I wanted to have somebody like David Koppel on the show to sift through all that stuff. He's definitely a leading mind in the pro-gun side of the academic study of firearms laws, and I think you guys are going to enjoy that episode. If you want to know a lot more about this case and the details of it, the specifics of it, definitely make sure you tune in for that episode once it goes up. Again, Sunday for members, Monday for everybody else. Moving on to our next story, though, we have President Biden back in the news and back to doubling down on his gun policy, on his emphasis on gun control in the 2024 election. He released a new ad this week, shortly after headlining a national conference by Everytown, the gun control group, in Washington, D.C. last week. He put out a new ad that emphasized his position on gun restrictions and attacked his opponent, former President Donald Trump, on his own gun record. And so, it's really a fascinating thing to see. I had an analysis piece this week, of course, that looked at sort of the risks and reward of doing this, of going down this path of making gun control a significant part of his reelection campaign. To me, I think it says that he's looking at a base strategy. He's looking to energize his voters, people who agree that we should have more stringent gun control laws, and trying to activate those people, trying to educate them or get them excited about his policy on trying to implement new restrictions, including, of course, a ban on AR-15s and other popular firearms, so-called assault weapons bans, which he has not shied away from at all in this election, and has in fact made really kind of the marquee policy for his reelection campaign. He hasn't been able to, of course, accomplish that policy. He hasn't been able to get it passed into law, but he has made it a big part of his reelection campaign, which is not something you would necessarily do if you're trying to reach out to moderates or swing voters. It's definitely something you would do, though, if you're trying to reach your own party. And there's good reason to think he should try to do that if he wants to win the election, because a lot of his weakness right now in the polling, which, to be fair, he has improved of late ever since Donald Trump was convicted of a number of felonies in New York State related to hush money payments made to Stormy Daniels and the cover-up that ensued from that, around the 2016 election. Biden has seen an increase in his polling. He's now pulled even or slightly ahead of Donald Trump in most national polling. And I believe he's leading with independents in a number of polls for the first time all election. So he has his position has improved, but he has a significant ways to go before I think he gets back to the level that he enjoyed of support with his own party, even before the 2020 election. So that seems to be what his campaign is primarily focusing on, trying to energize his own base voters. And this play is one, I think, that's dedicated to that proposition. He's trying to get committed Democrats to look at his gun record, which people have not approved of. He's had a lower approval rating on gun policy than he has in his overall policy, which has also been historically low, actually, at this point. His approval rating is very low, his general approval rating, and his approval rating on gun policy in particular is below that and has been that way his entire presidency. So part of that is almost certainly base Democrat voters who don't like that he hasn't accomplished a lot of the big ticket gun control items that he has advocated for, right? I mean, you look at the legislative accomplishments he's had, and he did pass one gun control bill, right? The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, but it didn't include a lot of the long held top priorities of the gun control movement. Didn't have universal background checks, and it didn't have an assault weapons ban. He hasn't been able to get those things across the line. And I think a lot of base voters on his side of the aisle hold that against him. And so here he is, I think, trying to make this more of a prominent issue in the race to show that he has done some things, right? He's got the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. He's got a number of executive orders that, for instance, the pistol brace ban or the ghost gun kit ban or the changes to who's required to get a license in order to sell used guns on the secondary market. Those sorts of executive actions are things he's trying to put front and center in this campaign to try and activate those wayward Democrats, perhaps. Of course, this and the reward there is, if he's able to do that, that could win him the election. If he's able to get his most reliable voters back out and back in his corner and turn them out to vote, obviously that would be go a long way to him winning re-election in a very tight race. Of course, at the same time, the risk there is similar in that in a very tight race like this will almost certainly be. The last several elections have been extremely tight races, regardless of the candidates. And I don't see the polling sure indicates that this one's going to also be very close with Biden slightly ahead. I think really they're tied in the national polling, and then Donald Trump still leading by a few points in most of the if not all of the battleground states to this point. So any change one way or the other in the electorate could be the decisive thing in this upcoming election. And the big risk of trying to activate your base voters by pushing heavily to the left on gun policy is that you could obviously alienate swing voters and independents, and even perhaps some of those Democrats who have become first-time gun owners since 2020. That was a big news story that we've talked about for years here at The Reload. A lot of Americans, a lot of minorities in America have bought guns for the first time in the last several years. And perhaps some of the disapproval of Biden's gun policy, obviously I would say a significant chunk of the disapproval on Biden's gun policy are people in the Republican Party or on the right who think that he's gone too far with what he's trying to restrict. But there's probably some percentage of that Democratic disapproval that feels the same way, maybe a substantial percentage as well, given how many people bought guns for the first time in the last 4 years. But, then you also, of course, have independents who, in the most recent Fox News poll, for instance, you have Biden leading by 2 points over Donald Trump. But on guns, he's actually trailing still by 2 points. And, a lot of that is because of members of his own party. But some of it is because independents are really split on this question. And, if you alienate a few points, few percentage points, one way or the other on this, and that changes the outcome of the election. So, Biden's making this big bet that going hard on gun control policy is going to help him, not hurt him. And, really, we're just going to have to see what happens during the election. But there's some reason that you can make a good case either way, frankly, on this point. And we'll keep you tuned. We'll keep you tuned in on what happens there. But and then I think just for our last, we're going to keep it pretty quick this week because, Jake's not here. I don't have anybody to bounce things off of, but I do want to try and cover our biggest stories that aren't going to be in the interview podcast. So, and this, although this might actually turn into an interview podcast, we'll see, maybe next week sometime. But we actually have a story from the Counteroffensive, which is a great publication that I am personally a subscriber to, a paid subscriber for, which is run by Tim Mack, who's a former NPR reporter, and he wrote a book on the NRA and its scandal. If you guys may recall, we published an excerpt from that about InfoCision and some of the fundraising woes that the NRA has, and some of the sort of shady deals that they've put in place over the years. But so Tim has written a lot about guns in the United States, but now he's also a war correspondent, and he's for the last several years now, I believe, a year at least, he's been over in Ukraine covering the war there on the ground, real shoe leather journalism in country, covering what's happening there. And one of the fascinating developments that he wrote about this week, which he allowed us to republish at the Reload, but you should also check out, there's a bit more context over at the Counteroffensive. Make sure you head over there and give those guys, give them a look, just see what you think. Like I said, it's an independent publication like us doing on the ground reporting. Hard to beat that, I think, in this day and age. Not that many on the ground reporters in Ukraine from trustworthy outlets anymore. So check them out. But one of the big developments there, of course, we talked about this at the beginning of the invasion, was the change in attitudes toward guns from Ukrainian lawmakers and civilians. Ukraine, like much of Europe and the former Soviet bloc, had very strict gun laws for a very long time. No gun rights are recognized in their founding documents or anything like that. Very different from the United States, pretty typical of Europe, especially Eastern Europe. And so once the Russian tanks started rolling across the border, though, people became much more open to the idea of armed civilians as a way to both supplement the military forces there, but also as just a means of self-defense. We've seen, obviously, Russian occupiers have committed a whole host of atrocities and war crimes, like what happened in Bucha, where they just slaughter civilians when they take over towns. I mean, this very real world, sort of non-theoretical aspect of armed self-defense going on in Ukraine. And when confronted with that reality, I think a lot of people changed their view of gun regulations in the country. And you did see them even handing out rifles on the streets at the darkest times of that early invasion. Well, obviously things have stabilized a bit since then. They've repelled part of that invasion, obviously still in an active war with a much larger opponent across their border and inside of their country. But those attitudes on guns haven't necessarily, that appreciation for armed civilians hasn't necessarily gone completely away. And so Tim allowed us to republish this piece on one of the politicians, activists in Ukraine who's pushing for a gun rights bill in their parliament. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this name well, I'm sure, but his name is Marian Zablotsky, which feels like I should be able to pronounce that because my last name is Gutowski and it's not that far off. But regardless, he is the member of parliament over there who's pushing actively for a sort of Ukrainian Second Amendment. Here's a quote from him. He says, quote, if we had the same gun ownership percentage as the United States does, Russia would never have dared to invade us. And a lot of the things he says in this piece are going to be very familiar to gun rights activists here in the United States. There's a lot of things that have been argued about why armed civilians are necessary to the security of a free state, as the Second Amendment literally says, right? So it is, but it's fascinating to see it come from, a Ukrainian politician, even after several years of war in the country, to hear these sorts of justifications that he's giving for his belief that Ukrainians should have gun rights protections enshrined into their laws as well. So, the other half of this is that they've been conducting a sort of campaign to have American gun owners send firearms to Ukraine. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of legal hurdles that go into this, but they have been able to. So, I'm not suggesting that anyone listening just FedEx your gun over to Ukraine, but these guys have set up a legal system, it sounds like, to actually do that, and have already received some donated firearms from the United States to Ukrainian civilians and volunteers for the local defense forces and so forth. And here, another quote from Marian said, quote, there are more guns in the U.S. than necessary for the population's safety. Therefore, I thought some Americans might be willing to share their excess firearms or donate them to Ukrainians in need, which is actually not an unheard of thing. This is something that happened in World War II as well, where Americans donated firearms to the English during the Blitz. And, it's not something that is unheard of here. So it's interesting to see it start up on I think a much smaller scale at this point, without necessarily government backing from the United States. All likelihood, our president would probably oppose this sort of thing, but it's happening anyway. And it's really rather fascinating. And, one of the key takeaways to this piece, with some really great on the ground reporting, a lot of really quality interviews in here. You guys should really check out the full piece over at the Reload or at the Counteroffensive. And, but they're actually closer than you might think. That this bill that this Ukrainian politician is pushing for has already made it through the first round of voting. And while it still has a ways to go to be officially adopted, including making it through a second round of voting and being signed by President Zelensky, it seems like it's a bit further along than you might expect. And so this would be another one that's going to be fascinating to track for us, I think. But we're going to absolutely keep on top of it. And yeah, maybe we'll have Tim on the show next week. Let me know if you guys want to see that. I think it would be interesting to get an on the ground view of all this stuff. I think we were going to try and have him on today, but one, they have rolling blackouts there, so he's only available for limited times. I mean, he really is in country, subject to all the risks that go along with that, and the struggles to run a whole publication from Ukraine is truly impressive thing. But and then also, of course, the Supreme Court dropped Rahimi, which we ended up doing the interview podcast on that. But perhaps next week we can circle back to this and get a bit more detail on what's going on with gun rights in Ukraine. It'd be one of the first countries in Europe to adopt this sort of gun rights protections that they're looking to install. So I think it'd be fascinating. And so make sure you watch for that next week. But that's all we've got for you this week. Of course, another independent publication who is sponsoring the show is The Dispatch. And I'm going to go ahead and send you guys over to myself. I'll look a little bit different if you're watching on YouTube, but listen to me give you a nice pitch about why I think that The Dispatch is worth your time as well. That's right. This episode is brought to you by The Dispatch. We're doing one of these classic promo swaps with them, actually on Kevin Williamson's newsletter, which is one that I personally subscribe to and read pretty much every time it comes out. I've actually been a paying subscriber to The Dispatch since they launched. They have over 400,000 readers now. Jonah Goldberg and Steve Hayes and Chris Steyerwalt and Alapun. And there's so many people who write over there that I've long followed and respected and enjoyed their perspective. And of course, in addition to a lot of the great commentary that they have from people that you probably know better than me, the people who are more well-known than I, they also have a lot of really deep and original news reporting that they do. And so that's why I've been happy to have them as one of our sponsors, as a promo swap. I would definitely stand behind their work and recommend it to you guys in a way that I couldn't say for a lot of other publications out there. So, if you're interested in checking out the Dispatch, if you haven't heard of it before, or you haven't taken the time to go over and examine what they're bringing into the world from a journalistic standpoint, I think you should do it. And in fact, part of our promo swap includes a 30-day free trial for their paid version. So you'll get access to everything they have for free for 30 days. So you can read it and make up your own mind. Just follow the link in the description here or in our newsletter this week at The Reload. So that honestly, I just do legitimately recommend them. And so I'm glad to do this sort of promo swap because they're one of my favorite publications. And I think you guys will enjoy them if you enjoy what we do here at The Reload. So check out the Dispatch today at the link in our description.
No, the devil's got no